From Television City in Hollywood.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
Guys like us, we had it made. Those were the days.
And you knew when you were there.
Dance for girls and men, women. Mister, we could use a man like Herbert Hoover again. Didn't need no welfare state.
Everybody pulled his weight.
G.R.O. LaSalle ran great. Those were the days.
You just heard the theme song to the American sitcom All in the Family. In this song, two of the main characters from the show, Archie and Edith, reminisce on a time in America where things were better and how we could use the values and leadership of the good old days. This TV show is 50 years old, but I still hear this type of discourse, especially online, all the time. And I don't just mean that old people like nostalgia. Everybody likes nostalgia. But this hints at the idea that America was better sometime in the past. Make America Great Again is a great example of this. It's a phrase that perfectly encapsulates the idea that some vague time in the past was better for people, but it doesn't specify why it was better or for who was better. That's part of the comedy of this song. When Archie says, "Guys like us, we had it made," we're supposed to recognize that he means it was better for him and not for everybody. The theme song from this show is just one example of the political discourse from 50 years ago, more or less resembling the political discourse of today. My hope is that by analyzing All in the Family, we can get a better understanding of how to effectively communicate progressive ideas in order to make better progress. I don't want 50 years from now to have the same discussions as we have today. In this video, I want to go over some of the writer's intentions for the show. I want to break down how viewers perceived it. I'll be comparing and contrasting the generational conflicts of yesterday and today, and I'll also be giving a little bit of personal insight on how we can have better social and political discussions in the future. My name is Nick Cruz, and this is everything that I learned from watching All in the Family. Hope this looks good, because I don't know what I'm doing. All right, students, it's time for a history lesson. We're going to take a look at some of the events of the 1960s to give a little context to what the average American would be feeling prior to the release of the show. So in the 1960s, there was a huge push towards social equality. There was the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the anti-war movement, and the environmental movement. All of these progressive ideas were coming to public attention, and the government was actually passing legislation to address those issues. But there was a huge group of Americans, the silent majority, that thought that these efforts used taxpayer money to coddle those marginalized groups. They didn't see it as a good use of money or time. As the 60s were coming to an end, we're faced with the presidential election of 1968, and Lyndon B. Johnson is going to run again. But because of America's involvement in the Vietnam War, he doesn't have the best momentum. So, of course, the Democrats were going to choose a candidate that didn't support the Vietnam War, right? Right?
I am ready to lead our country.
That sucks. Okay. Hubert Humphrey's decision to support the Vietnam War efforts was not the only reason that Nixon got voted into office. There's plenty of reasons why that could have happened. But my point is, the Democratic Party had now splintered, and conservatives were able to pull ahead and vote Nixon into office. So now we're going into the 70s. We've got a conservative president who's trying to undo all of the progressive legislation from the previous administration. 1968 is the year with the most American casualties in Vietnam. And Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. So whether or not you were a Nixon supporter, you were probably feeling a little bit seasick from all this political turbulence. This is right around the time that Norman Lear pitches his idea for the show All in the Family. He had a vision to create a sitcom that could portray all of the social and political discussions of the 1970s within the living room of an average American home. Norman Lear was a left-leaning progressive and wanted the show to display bigotry and closed-mindedness in a way that was humorous and pointed out his opinions on conservative ideology. And he was going to do that by creating the most hard-headed conservative character the country had ever seen, Archie Bunker.
What the hell is going on here?
All right, let's go over some characters. So we have 4 main characters in this show. The first one here is Archie. He's the father and head of the household. His wife is Edith, and together they had Gloria. Gloria is married to Michael Stivic, and they all live in Archie's house in New York. There are a lot of other recurring characters, many of which who were popular enough to get their own spin-off series, but these are the main 4 that I want to focus on. Okay, I want to start with Edith. Edith is a housewife who's usually portrayed as being pretty ditzy and timid, but she's often the voice of reason throughout the episodes. She's also my favorite character in the series, and if you don't agree, just watch the episode where she has jury duty on a murder trial. She knows that the man on trial is innocent and ends up being the only dissenter for 2 days before eventually being proven right and keeping an innocent man from going to jail. She's a total queen. Okay, next up is Gloria, and I've heard a weird amount of hate on Gloria online, and I don't quite understand it. I think she's a really interesting and cool character. She's super intelligent and knowledgeable, and she has the same progressive outlook on the world as her husband, but she's a lot more passionate and understanding than Michael is. Whenever there's an argument between Archie and Michael, she can sometimes end up being the mediator because she has a way better understanding of Archie and holds the same values as Michael. All right, next up is Michael. Michael is not my favorite character, but he is important. He's a perpetual college student who does not have a job throughout the entire series, and although he's not a stereotypical hippie, he represents the progressive youth of the 70s. He makes it known that he is aware about every injustice in the world, and he often protests the actions of the American government. Michael is super combative against Archie and is not afraid to call him out for being offensive, hypocritical, or just straight up wrong. All right, next up is Archie. Archie is a bigoted, cigar-chomping, conservative World War II veteran. He's super hardworking and has strong values that he truly believes in. He works as a dock foreman, which is kind of like a manager for cargo that comes in and out of a port. And he also has a second job as a cab driver at night. His purpose in the show is to be a caricature of a lot of the older conservatives of the 1970s. A lot of the jokes in the show are at his expense, but since he's so secure and confident in his values, he has a tendency to be oblivious when characters are making fun of him. Many of the beliefs that Archie holds are harmful and closed-minded. He constantly belittles and yells at his wife. He criticizes anyone who's different from him, and he uses slurs. He's anti-Semitic, he's sexist, and uses homophobic language. A great example of typical Archie is when the Jeffersons move in next door. They're a black family, and at first he assumes that Louise is a maid for another family, and then after finding out that they're moving in, he does everything he can to keep them out. Although Archie is the butt of a lot of jokes, and he is outwardly racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, his character can be really charming and likable. He's the center of attention throughout the series and has frequent moments of vulnerability and introspection that transform him from an over-the-top caricature into a really complex and likable character. Meanwhile, Michael is really unlikable. A lot of the time it feels like he uses his political opinions just to rile up Archie, and he can be really selfish and ungrateful for all the sacrifices that Archie makes to put a roof over the family's head. If Norman Lear's goal for the series was to show that bigotry and closed-mindedness is the wrong perspective, then what is the purpose of making Archie so likable and central in the show? And why would Norman Lear choose to make Michael such a selfish, arrogant, and entitled person? It makes me question who the intended audience is for this show. Is it for a bigoted audience that feels validated and can relate to Archie, or is it for a progressive audience that can laugh at him? After watching the show and reflecting on the cultural impact, whether intentional or not, it's clear that this appeals to both.
Lady Liberty standing there in the harbor with her torch on high, screaming out to all the nations in the world, send me your poor, your deadbeats, your filthy.
Let's talk about Breaking Bad for a second. Like All in the Family, Breaking Bad kind of has two different fan bases. There are those who see Walter White as a villain or maybe an anti-hero, and then there are those who idolize him. I think that both of these fan bases, for the most part, grasp that he's a complicated character that is not just good or bad, but I think it's fair to separate the fan bases into those two groups. The show is kind of a critique on the pursuit of wealth and power and how our pride and ego can corrupt us, but they write Walter in a way that it's really easy to sympathize with him, and we often are rooting for him, even when he's doing things that are morally wrong. The complexity of his character is what allows fans to come to their own conclusions. Although I don't think the fans who tend to idolize him more are necessarily grasping the whole picture, there are a lot of moments in this show where it's clear that we're supposed to be rooting for Walt. Despite his flaws, the show makes Walt look cool, and we almost always understand why he's doing what he's doing. Walter White is written in a similar way to Archie. Archie is not supposed to be the good guy, but because he's written to be so genuine and so likable, he's almost coded to be the good guy. Having a deeply bigoted character be such a likable and central part of your TV show, especially when it's a super popular TV show, can be pretty damaging. I don't think that the show does quite enough to challenge viewers who have similar views to Archie. If you're someone who is already deeply homophobic, racist, sexist, or just bigoted in general, this show is not going to challenge you to change your mind because Archie is someone that you like and relate to. So I don't think that this is necessarily the audience's fault. I don't think that the people who relate to Archie and like him are wrong. Just like the fans who idolize Walter, I don't think it's their fault. So is it the writer's fault? In my opinion, kind of. The main issue comes from the fact that in order to have a successful show that gets picked up by a network, you can't attack an entire demographic of people. If Norman Lear had decided to alienate all American conservatives, the show wouldn't have even been picked up in the first place. I don't think there was any reason that Archie Bunker needed to be the central character that audiences can sympathize with, when Michael could have filled that role as the progressive if he just weren't so insufferable. Every time I look up this show online, they're just ranting and raving about how progressive and forward-thinking this show was, but I always think, why didn't this show do more? All of this discussion so far has revolved around the show being able to validate people's preconceived notions, whether you're conservative or liberal. But that doesn't really explain why boomers made this shift from being progressive hippies into Archie Bunkers. So why aren't boomers progressive anymore?
Gee, it's getting like politics in America is only for the rich. Who's been feeding you that commie crapola?
When I first watched this show and I saw the explosive dynamic between a young progressive boomer and their conservative, intolerant parents, I couldn't help but wonder why Michael's generation turned into Archie's. The 60s that a lot of boomers grew up in was a really progressive time where we made a lot of social change. But for some reason, now they're the demographic that seems to be the most intolerant to change. The reality is, there was not actually really a switch. Boomers just were not the progressive hippies that we thought they were. Louis Menard is a writer for The New Yorker, and they detail this in their article, The Misconception About Baby Boomers in the 60s. They go into detail about how between 1957 and 1964, 33.5 million boomers were born. That makes them extremely unlikely to have taken part in the social movements of the 60s because they would have been way too young. They also go into detail about how a lot of the influential artists and progressives of the 60s were actually born before 1940, which makes them part of the silent generation. I think it's important to note that trying to categorize an entire generation as one thing is not fair, and there's a lot of different types of people within all generations. But I don't think it's unfair to point out that a lot of boomers supported policies that have made life harder for younger generations. A lot of boomers in the 80s and some in the 70s supported things like decreased government intervention, deregulation of major corporations, and then supported things like Reaganomics that have made life dramatically harder for younger generations. However, boomers did have some really good reasons to feel distrustful of the government. Vietnam War, the US was sending thousands of citizens to go be killed over what was essentially a global power play. Watergate proved that corruption was even at the highest level of the presidency. And the Kent State shooting proved that US institutions were willing to kill their own citizens just for exercising their right to protest. These are all real and legitimate reasons to not feel trusting in the government, but that resulted in a lot of hands-off policies that have made progress really difficult today. I'm not the only one who noticed this, though, because millennials have been having a feud on TikTok against their boomer parents for the past few years.
I'd have that hat off and that cigar right.
I don't think I've ever seen you swim. Do you know how to swim?
I swim like a frog.
I've never seen you in a bathing suit.
Millions of people see me.
So I already discussed a little bit about how and why I think All in the Family can be a little bit soft when it comes to challenging conservative ideas, but I do want to give the show credit where it's due. This show was revolutionary for its time simply for acknowledging the existence of some of our social issues. It was one of the first shows to depict the women's liberation movement. It did that through Gloria, and it was also one of the first to depict a working class family who was white. Something I really like about this show is that they made Michael a little bit of a misogynist, a pretty big misogynist. He's not as bad as Archie, but he's a misogynist for sure, even though he's supposed to be the progressive. I think that's a really good decision because it points out that injustices are everywhere, and whether it was intentional or not, I think it's a good message to send to the viewer to say, hey, keep yourselves in check. The only reason that I chose this show in the first place was because there are so many moments that stand out to me as being so much more forward-thinking than I ever would have expected a TV show from the 70s to be. Due to the rise of reactive social media content, a lot of millennials are taking a much more aggressive approach towards calling out their boomer parents. One topic that's particularly popular on TikTok right now is lead poisoning. A lot of the content online is centered around the symptoms of lead poisoning because boomers have a higher chance of being exposed to lead as kids. They're saying that it can cause increased aggression, lower intelligence, and even a lack of empathy. And I've seen a couple creators even use it to explain the recent shooting of a young girl who pulled into the wrong driveway. Other types of media that aim to criticize boomers include discussing the housing crisis, or how misunderstanding technology can be frustrating, or just boomers' general entitlement and arrogance. Another type of content that I see a lot has to do with how boomers typically only needed one job to support a whole family, yet they have extremely high expectations for younger people's work ethic. A lot of these TikToks make great points, and one that I particularly like is from this creator, who goes over a lot of the things that I mentioned in this video. That being said, there is an overwhelming amount of content that makes sweeping generalizations and doesn't provide a good enough scope of our social and political landscape. This trend also allows young people to use boomers as a kind of scapegoat for our problems. There are deep-rooted issues in this country that need to be addressed, and it's too easy to just place the blame on a previous generation. We need to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable and asking the harder questions about how we fix this. So how does this type of content compare with All in the Family when it comes to social and political discourse? In some ways it's better because it more directly calls out some of the beliefs that have contributed to a lot of the issues we're still dealing with today. However, due to the way that content is shared and promoted online, we're a lot less likely to find content that we disagree with. Another issue with this type of content is that it can be trendy, so it's not uncommon to see someone who doesn't understand the full context hopping on the trend and making more and more reactive content. Boomers are also notoriously terrible with technology, so they don't have an even playing field to defend themselves on. When there was that ridiculous Gen Z versus millennial feud online, it was way more of a back and forth because millennials actually had the skills to respond. I think it's also worth noting that that feud was really short-lived, and I think part of that is because millennials had the skill to come back at some of the criticisms that were being made, and then it was a lot easier to see how ridiculous it was. Boomer content, however, is still going strong even after a few years. So although I don't think that the way some young people have chosen to address their issues with boomers is fantastic, something that I do really like is that there's no pressure to be picked up by a network to hold people's criticism back. So what's our happy medium? What can we learn from online content and All in the Family about how to have meaningful discourse, especially when it comes to generational gaps?
I'll say we have equality, right? Right. Right, Michael?
Let's think about that a minute.
Generational wars are not going to go away. It's a very normal thing to do to categorize people into groups and make assumptions. It helps us understand things that might otherwise be really overwhelming. But we need to be careful because the person who's the best at generalizing is Archie. He has an opinion on any group of people you could imagine, and he loves to make assumptions about them. When we look back on our previous generations and try to learn from them, it's important to make sure that we know that our assumptions can sometimes not hold the full picture. When I first encountered boomer content online, it totally fulfilled an assumption that I already had, that young people were all progressive and that boomers used to be hippies and now they're out of touch and holding us back. When I look back on my experience watching All in the Family, I think one of the things the show does best is humanize the people we disagree with. So although I don't really agree with Archie ever, it was a pretty interesting experience to be able to look at him and try to figure out why he thinks the way he does. There are a lot of times where looking at the other side is not a good idea and can be a distraction and a waste of time. And a great example of that is the stupid litter box thing that conservative media was trying to push recently. It was really just an attack on the LGBTQ plus community and tried to belittle the actual oppression and issues that that community faces. One thing that I would like to see a lot more of in the media is long-form content. I think because of social media and because of the 24-hour news cycle, we get a lot of our information in headlines or little snippets. I think this can be a problem because it really incentivizes reactionary content and things come and go way too quickly. There are tons of awesome resources online and on streaming services for long-form content where creators really dive into topics that they passionately care about. A great example of this is John Oliver's Last Week Tonight. I don't think the show is perfect, but something that I really like about it is that it'll take its time to go over a topic for the entire segment of the show. I think that that is a really necessary way of talking about political and social issues because it gives time to break down the whole scope of a problem. All in the Family's strongest quality is that it's able to show different perspectives without ever giving too much credit to the Archies of the world. It's not as direct or as honest as content online can be, but it never sacrifices its own ideology for the sake of bipartisanship. My main takeaway from the show is that if in the future we want to have meaningful and effective discussions, we need to think like Gloria. Gloria gets her dad. She understands why he thinks the way he does, but she doesn't agree and never gives him a free pass just because she gets him. We also need to think like Edith. Edith stood up to an entire jury because she knew she was right. She stood up for herself because she believed it. Michael and Archie never, ever, ever convince each other to think like one another, but they don't ever really try. There's no effort on either of their part to change the way they communicate so that the other person can see what they're saying. Discussions will look like that forever. We will always have a Michael versus Archie situation when we're having a discussion. But if we want to actually make progress, we will fight to make sure that the young generations of 2070 don't look at us the way that we look at boomers. I went over a lot of information and a lot of opinions in this video. If there's anything that you disagree with, thought I could do better, or really liked, please let me know. I would love to hear your feedback, and I will read every comment I get on this video. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Nick Cruz, and I hope I see you again soon. Bye.
All in the Family was recorded on tape before a live audience.